There's a specific feeling when you sign a loan document. Your hand moves across the paper, the pen feels heavier than it should, and somewhere in your chest, a small voice says, "What have I done?" You've felt it. Most people have. That tightening. That quiet dread of having just committed yourself to something larger than your current life. That feeling is real. But what it means, that's where most people get it completely wrong. We've been taught, somewhere between childhood and adulthood, that debt is failure wearing a suit, that a loan is a confession of inadequacy, that the responsible person pays cash, stays small, and sleeps without worry. And so, millions of people avoid borrowing entirely, or they borrow badly, for the wrong things, at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons. And then the fear proves itself right. The debt becomes the trap they always suspected it was. But here's what nobody told you. The fear isn't about the money. Neuroscientists studying financial decision-making have found that losing money, or anticipating loss, activates the same neural circuits as physical pain. Your brain doesn't distinguish between a broken bone and a broken budget. Both register as threat. Both trigger the same retreat response, which means most of what people believe about debt isn't financial analysis at all. It's the nervous system protecting itself from discomfort. And the nervous system is not a good financial advisor. What this audiobook is going to do is something uncomfortable. It's going to ask you to separate the feeling from the fact, to look at debt not as a moral condition, not as evidence of weakness or recklessness or greed, but as a mechanism, a tool with specific properties. Properties that, when understood precisely, can either hollow out your future or build it faster than savings alone ever could. The wealthy don't avoid debt. They choose it deliberately. They know which kind destroys and which kind compounds. They understand that the same instrument that chains one person to a paycheck can give another person 10 properties and 20 years of freedom. The difference isn't luck. It isn't income. It's knowledge applied with discipline. You're about to acquire that knowledge. And more than that, you're going to understand why it works. Not just the rules, but the mechanics underneath the rules. The psychology, the mathematics, the philosophy of using other people's money to build something that lasts. This is not a book about getting rich quick. It's a book about thinking clearly about debt, perhaps for the first time. Start there. Everything else follows. Before we go deeper, take a quick second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always find it amazing how people from different parts of the world connect through these messages. Chapter 1. Borrow for investment, not consumption. You know the feeling of a purchase you regretted within a week. The thing is still in your house, maybe still has the tag on it, and every time you see it, there's a small, quiet cost, not just the money, but the reminder that you chose wrong. Now imagine that feeling attached to a monthly payment for 3 years. That is consumer debt. And it is not just a financial mistake, it is a psychological sentence. The first thing you need to understand, genuinely understand, not just agree with, is that debt has no moral character. It isn't good or evil in itself. What gives it character is the direction you point it. Borrow money and pour it into something that loses value the moment you acquire it, and the debt becomes a drain. A slow leak in the floor of your financial life that you keep mopping up without ever finding the source. Borrow money and direct it towards something that generates more than it costs, and the debt becomes an engine. It runs while you sleep. It works weekends. It doesn't ask for time off. The economists call this the distinction between consumption and investment. But the behavioral economist Richard Thaler would point to something deeper, a concept called mental accounting. Humans don't treat money as the unified, fungible resource it actually is. We categorize it emotionally. We have fun money and serious money, and I deserve this money. And when we take out a loan, the brain often files it under a different mental account than the one tracking what we already owe. The loan feels like new money, fresh capital, permission. And so we spend it like permission, on the thing we've been wanting, not the thing that will pay us back. This is the trap, not the interest rate, the psychology beneath the signature. Here's the rule, stated without decoration. If the thing you're borrowing money to acquire does not put money back into your pocket, you should not borrow to acquire it. That's it. That's the entire framework. Everything else in this chapter is just unpacking why that rule is harder to follow than it sounds. When you borrow to buy a car that's more expensive than transportation requires, you're paying interest on depreciation. The moment that vehicle leaves the lot, it begins its long, slow surrender of value, and you are financing that surrender month by month with money that has a cost attached to it. You're paying the bank for the privilege of watching something become worth less. That is a double loss that most people never calculate because they're focused on the monthly payment, not the total architecture of the deal. Consumer debt is seductive because it feels like expansion. It feels like you've grown your life. New car in the driveway, new clothes in the closet, the vacation photos already uploaded. But what you've actually done is borrow against your future self to give your present self a temporary upgrade. And your future self, the one making those payments 18 months from now, didn't get a vote. The ancient Romans had a phrase, pecunia non olet, money has no smell. Vespasian said it about tax revenue from public toilets. The point was that money doesn't carry the memory of where it came from. But debt is different. Debt smells exactly like whatever you bought with it. And when the thing you bought is already gone, eaten, worn, faded, forgotten, the debt still sits there, still smelling of something that no longer exists. Good debt operates by entirely different logic. When you borrow at 6% to invest in something returning 12%, you are profiting on money that was never yours. The spread between those two numbers, that gap, is the mechanism of wealth. You are using the bank's capital as raw material and your judgment as the labor. The bank gets its interest. You keep everything above it. A rental property with positive cash flow, after all expenses, is self-liquidating debt. The tenant services the loan. You collect the difference. A business loan that funds inventory for confirmed orders is self-liquidating debt. The sales pay the bank back before you do. In both cases, the asset carries its own weight. You're not working to feed the debt is working to feed you. And here's the insight that rarely gets stated plainly. The risk profile of these two types of debt is not just different in degree. It's different in kind. When you borrow to consume, all the risk lands on your personal income. If your circumstances change, the vacation doesn't give the money back. The dress doesn't refund you. The debt remains naked and permanent, with nothing underneath it but your labor. When you borrow to invest, properly with margin and calculation, the asset itself absorbs a portion of the risk. The tenant pays. The equipment produces. Your personal exposure is insulated by the thing you bought. This is why people with millions in debt sleep better than people with thousands in credit card bills. It's not because they're reckless. It's because their debt has collateral behind it that earns. Their debt is covered. The middle-class borrower's debt is covered by nothing except hope and a paycheck. I'll tell you something I think most financial content skips over. The hardest part of this principle isn't understanding it. It's the identity work. Because consumer borrowing isn't just a financial habit. It's a social performance. the car, the vacation, the renovation. These are signals. They communicate something about who you are or who you want people to believe you are. Giving that up, choosing the boring, invisible move of not upgrading, not signaling, not performing, requires a shift in what you're optimizing for. You have to stop optimizing for how your life looks and start optimizing for how your balance sheet works. Every dollar you borrow must have a mission. If it's not going somewhere that sends more dollars back, don't borrow it. Pay cash. Or don't buy it. There is no third option that works. Chapter 2. Borrow only what you can repay. Most people who get into serious debt trouble weren't reckless. They were optimistic. That's the part nobody warns you about. It's rarely greed that sinks a borrower. It's a completely ordinary human tendency, the quiet, confident assumption that the future will be better than the present, that the business will grow, that the promotion will come, that things will work out because they usually do. And so they borrow against that future, against the version of their life that exists only in projection. And then the projection doesn't arrive on schedule. And the debt does. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman spent decades documenting what he called the planning fallacy, the near-universal human tendency to underestimate costs, underestimate time, and overestimate returns when planning future endeavors. It doesn't matter how intelligent you are. It doesn't matter how much experience you have. The bias runs deep, and it runs consistently in one direction, toward optimism, toward the best-case scenario presented as the likely scenario. This is precisely why hope is not a repayment strategy. Before you sign any loan agreement, the question is not, will this probably work out? The question is, can I service this debt today with the income I have right now in the life I am actually living, not the life I'm planning to live? If the answer requires a future event that hasn't happened yet, a raise, a client, a deal closing, a market recovering, you have borrowed from a person who doesn't exist yet, and that person may never arrive. The Stoics had a practice for exactly this kind of thinking. They called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Before committing to any significant action, you deliberately rehearse the worst case, not to become paralyzed by it, but to strip away the emotional optimism and see the actual structure of the risk. Marcus Aurelius did this before military campaigns. Seneca did it before financial decisions. You should do it before you borrow. Sit with the loan you're considering. Then ask, what happens if my income drops by 30% next month? What happens if the investment takes twice as long to generate returns as projected? What happens if the tenant leaves, the client cancels, the market shifts? Can I still make this payment? Not comfortably. Just make it. If the honest answer is no, the loan is too large. Full stop. This isn't pessimism, it's architecture. You're not building for the best case. You're building for the structure to survive the worst case. The mathematical tool for this is your debt-to-income ratio, total monthly debt obligations divided by gross monthly income. Keep that number conservative, not at the ceiling the bank approves, but well below it, because the bank's ceiling is calculated for their protection, not yours. Lenders model for average default rates across large populations. They're not modeling for your specific life, your health, your industry, your family, the particular vulnerabilities that only you know about. You need to model for those, which means your personal ceiling should be lower than theirs, meaningfully lower. Just because a lender offers you $100,000 doesn't mean you should take $100,000. That offer is not a compliment. It's a product. They're selling you debt, and like any salesperson, they will offer you the maximum you might conceivably accept. The discipline to take less than what's offered, to look at an approval letter and say, "I'll take 60% of this," is one of the rarest and most valuable financial skills a person can develop. There's another danger that gets far too little attention: the psychology of collateral. When you pledge an asset, your home, your business equipment, your savings, as security for a loan, something subtle happens in your mind. The commitment feels abstract because the asset is still in your possession. You still drive the car. You still live in the house. The collateral feels theoretical until the moment it isn't, until the lender exercises their right, and the theoretical becomes physical and immediate. The bank does not hesitate at that moment. The contract is clear, and the enforcement is mechanical. They do not factor in that you've been a loyal customer for 12 years, or that you missed the payment because your child was hospitalized, or that you're 3 weeks away from a deal that would solve everything. The contract has a date. You either met it or you didn't. This is the piece of leverage that most borrowers don't feel in their body until it's too late. You must feel it now before you sign. You must hold the weight of what you're actually putting at risk, not just numerically, but viscerally. The house is not just collateral on a spreadsheet. It's where your family lives. The business assets are not just line items. They're years of your labor made physical. Respect that. Let it govern how much you borrow, and build your margin of safety, not as an afterthought, but as a design principle. The gap between what the lender will approve and what you actually take. That gap is not empty space. That gap is your freedom of movement. It's the room to absorb a bad month without missing a payment. It's the distance between a difficult period and a catastrophic one. Borrow less than you could, repay faster than required. These two habits, practiced consistently, keep the power in your hands. The moment your debt load exceeds your ability to service it without perfect conditions, the power transfers to the lender. And lenders are not interested in your well-being. They are interested in their contract. Stay on the right side of that equation, not through luck, through calculation. Chapter 3. The Mechanics of Leverage. Archimedes said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." He was talking about physics, but he was also, without knowing it, describing the only mechanism that has ever created generational wealth. The lever is debt, the fulcrum is cash flow, and the world you're moving is your own financial future. But here's what the quote leaves out, and what most explanations of leverage also leave out. The lever requires a fixed point. Without the fulcrum, the lever is just a stick. You can push on it with everything you have, and nothing moves. In finance, that fixed point is stable, positive cash flow. Without it, leverage has no anchor. The system doesn't amplify your returns. It amplifies your losses, and it does so with the same mechanical indifference with which it would have amplified your gains. This is the part people hear selectively. They understand the upside. They absorb the mortgage math, the 5 properties instead of 1, the 50% return instead of 10, and they feel the pull of it. What they don't sit with long enough is the physics working in reverse. If you put 20% down and the asset loses 20% of its value, you haven't lost 20%. You've lost 100% of your equity. The lever doesn't know which direction you wanted it to go. So before the math, the principle, leverage is not a strategy for the optimistic. It's a strategy for the precise. Now the math, because it genuinely matters, and most people have never seen it laid out clearly enough to feel it. You have $100,000. The fearful version of you puts it into one property worth $100,000, paid in full, no debt, no risk, no exposure. The property appreciates 10% in a year. You've made $10,000. Your return on investment is 10%. That's not bad, but it won't change your life. The investor who understands leverage takes that same $100,000 and splits it into 5 down payments of $20,000 each. 5 properties, each worth $100,000, purchased with the bank's money filling the remaining 80%. Same 10% appreciation across the market. Each property gains $10,000 in value. 5 properties means $50,000 in total gains on the same initial capital. Your return isn't 10%, it's 50%. And here's the detail that matters most. The bank doesn't participate in that appreciation. The bank wants its interest payments. That's the ceiling of their ambition. Every dollar above the interest, every dollar of appreciation, every dollar of rental income above the mortgage cost belongs entirely to you. You have used their capital as a raw material and kept the finished product. This is what other people's money actually means. It's not a slogan. It's a precise description of a mechanism. You are not just multiplying your money, you are multiplying your time. Because somewhere in that equation, other people, tenants, customers, clients, are working hours that ultimately flow toward your balance sheet. Leverage doesn't just compound money. It compounds the labor of others into your net worth. When you understand that, the concept stops being abstract. The engine that makes this work is positive arbitrage. The asset must generate more than the debt costs. If you borrow at 5% and the investment yields 8%, you are pocketing 3% on money that was never yours to begin with. That spread, maintained consistently across a portfolio, across years, is how empires are built quietly. Not through a single spectacular bet, but through the patient accumulation of spread. There's a third player in this arrangement that almost nobody mentions: inflation. And inflation, for the leveraged investor with fixed-rate debt, is not an enemy. It's a silent partner. When you take a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, your payment is locked in nominal terms. It doesn't change. But inflation means the dollar you're repaying within year 20 is worth less than the dollar you borrowed in year 1. You borrowed expensive dollars. You're repaying with cheap ones. Meanwhile, the asset, real estate, a business, productive equipment, tends to rise with inflation. The rent you charge rises with inflation. So your income from the asset grows. Your debt payment stays flat. The gap between them widens every year, quietly, automatically, without you doing anything. Savers experience inflation as loss. The money in their account buys less each year. Leveraged investors with hard assets experience inflation as a subsidy. Their real debt burden shrinks while their asset value grows. This is not an accident of the system. This is the system working exactly as designed, rewarding those who deploy capital into productive assets and slowly penalizing those who hoard it. I want to say something here that most financial content won't say directly. The refusal to use leverage isn't just a conservative strategy. In many cases, it's a decision to stay poor slowly. It feels safe. It feels responsible. And for a certain personality type, the type that values certainty above growth, it might genuinely be the right choice. But you should make that choice consciously, with full knowledge of what you're trading away. You're trading the amplification of returns for the comfort of sleeping without obligation. That trade has a price. Calculate it before you decide it's worth paying. Because the financial system is not neutral. The tax code rewards borrowers who invest. Interest on investment debt is often deductible. Depreciation on assets reduces taxable income. The government has encoded a preference for producers inside the tax structure itself. By refusing to engage with debt, you're swimming against a current that was designed to carry you if you'd only stop fighting it. Become precise. Run the numbers conservatively. Build cash reserves before you use leverage. Understand the downside as clearly as you understand the upside. And then, when the math works and the fulcrum is solid, use the lever. That's not recklessness. That's physics. Chapter 4. Channel income increases into debt repayment. The raise arrives. Maybe it's significant. Maybe it's modest. Either way, there's a moment, usually within 48 hours, where your mind starts quietly furnishing a slightly better version of your life. A better car, a nicer apartment, the restaurant you've been walking past for months, the vacation that's been sitting in your browser history. That moment is the test. And most people fail it without realizing they were being tested. This isn't a character flaw. It's a documented psychological mechanism. Researchers Brickman and Campbell identified something they called hedonic adaptation, the brain's tendency to return to a stable baseline of satisfaction regardless of what changes in your external circumstances. You get the nicer apartment. Within 3 to 6 months, it's just where you live. The novelty metabolizes completely. The pleasure evaporates. But the higher rent, or the car payment, or the credit card balance from the vacation, that stays. That compounds. That follows you. The upgrade delivered approximately 4 months of elevated satisfaction. The debt payment will deliver 48 months of obligation. You traded a temporary neurological event for a permanent financial one. And because hedonic adaptation is unconscious, you won't even remember making the trade. You'll just notice, sometime around month 8, that you're somehow still stretched thin despite earning more than you did 2 years ago. This is lifestyle creep, and it is the single most effective wealth prevention mechanism ever devised because it requires no external force. It operates entirely through your own desires. Here's what you need to understand about the loan you're currently holding. In the early months, and in the case of a long mortgage, the early years, the majority of your monthly payment is not reducing your debt. It is paying rent on the money you borrowed. The bank structures amortization deliberately this way. They collect the bulk of their interest first, before you've made meaningful progress on the principal. You're working hard, making payments faithfully, and the balance is barely moving. This is not an accident. This is the design. But there's a mechanism built into the same system that works entirely in your favor, if you're willing to use it. Every dollar you pay above the minimum required payment attacks the principal directly, not the interest, the principal. And when you reduce the principal, you eliminate not just that dollar of debt, but every dollar of future interest that would have accrued on it across the remaining life of the loan. You're not just paying down debt. You're buying back future payments that haven't been charged yet. A $500 a month raise directed entirely at a mortgage principal doesn't just pay $500 of debt per month. It can delete years from the back end of the loan schedule. The mathematics of this are genuinely startling when you run them. The interest saved often exceeds the extra payments made. You are generating a guaranteed, risk-free return equivalent to your loan's interest rate, and there is no investment product anywhere that can match a guaranteed return. The stock market can promise you nothing. Paying down your debt at 7% guarantees you 7% every time, with zero risk. Most people miss this because they're seduced by what they think is the smarter move, keeping the bonus in a savings account just in case, while continuing to pay the loan at minimum. This feels prudent. It feels like liquidity and responsibility. But if your loan is charging you 7% and your savings account is paying you 2%, you are losing 5% per year on every dollar sitting in that account. You are literally paying the bank to hold your money while simultaneously paying them interest on money they lent you. You are funding both sides of their operation. Direct the surplus at the principal immediately before it becomes something else. The discipline required here is not complicated in theory and brutal in practice. The money arrives. You do not negotiate with yourself about it. You do not let it sit in the account for a week while you think about it. The thinking has already been done. The decision was made in advance. The surplus goes to the debt. That's the policy. Policies don't require willpower in the moment because the moment of decision has been moved to a calmer time when the money wasn't yet in your hand. Your neighbors should not know you got a promotion. Your clothes should not change. Your car should remain exactly what it was. The only thing that should change is the number on your loan statement, and it should be moving faster toward zero than the lender ever intended. I'll be honest about something. This is genuinely difficult in a way that financial content rarely acknowledges. Because it's not just about money. It's about identity. The raise feels like evidence that you've earned an upgrade. The bonus feels like permission. And choosing not to act on that, choosing to live the same external life while your balance sheet quietly transforms, requires a kind of invisible confidence, a comfort with being underestimated, a willingness to look exactly as financially ordinary as you did before, while actually doing something extraordinary underneath. Most people need external validation that they're succeeding. The person who channels every raise into debt repayment has decided they don't. They're keeping score on a ledger that nobody else can see. There's also a psychological dimension to debt that doesn't appear in any loan document. Debt is not just a financial number. It's a constraint on your entire life architecture. It keeps you in jobs you've outgrown because you have payments to make. It prevents you from taking risks because the downside is a missed payment, and a missed payment has consequences. It runs quietly in the background of every major decision. Career moves, relationship decisions, where you live, shaping your options without ever announcing itself. Every payment above the minimum is buying back a small piece of that freedom. You're not just reducing a number. You're expanding the range of choices your future self will have. When the debt is finally gone, the stream of income you've been directing at the lender, the base salary plus every raise, every bonus, every surplus, suddenly belongs entirely to you. That is the moment the mathematics of wealth become accessible, but you can only reach that moment by refusing to let the upgrades arrive before the debt is dead. The seed corn must not be eaten before it's planted. Chapter 5. Distinguish good debt from bad debt. Pick up every loan you currently hold, mentally, one at a time, and ask a single question. Not, can I afford this? Not, is the interest rate reasonable? Those are secondary questions. The primary question is this: does this debt generate income, or does it consume it? That's the entire framework. Everything else is commentary. The reason most people never achieve genuine financial freedom isn't that they earn too little or save too rarely. It's that they're carrying debt in both hands, some of it building, some of it draining, and they've never clearly separated the two. They service the whole pile with the same monthly anxiety, never distinguishing between the obligation that's working for them and the one that's quietly dismantling them. The two feel identical in the moment of payment. They are not identical in what they're doing to your life. Bad debt has a precise definition, and it's this: money borrowed to acquire something that decreases in value and generates no income. That's it. The interest rate doesn't make it bad. The lender doesn't make it bad. The purpose makes it bad. When you finance a lifestyle, clothes, vacations, furniture, a car that's more status than transport, you are mortgaging future hours of your labor for a present experience that will fade. The experience metabolizes. The payment remains. The most insidious form of bad debt is the one people defend most vigorously: the car loan for something nicer than necessary. And I understand the defense. Transportation feels like a need. Comfort in daily commuting feels reasonable. But the moment the vehicle choice crosses from function into signal, from getting you there into telling people something about you, the debt has become a vanity tax. You are paying interest on an identity performance, and that performance depreciates at roughly the same rate as the vehicle itself. There's a psychological mechanism underneath this that the psychologist Robert Cialdini identified: the principle of commitment and consistency. Once you've signed for something, the brain doesn't neutrally evaluate whether it was the right decision. It works to justify the decision. It finds reasons the purchase was wise, the debt was manageable, the upgrade was deserved. This is why people defend bad debt with such conviction. They're not reasoning about the debt, they're protecting a decision they already made. The brain has already committed, and consistency demands it was the right call. This is why the evaluation must happen before the signature. After it, you're arguing with your own psychology. Good debt operates by a completely different logic. And the key distinction is one that almost never gets stated clearly enough. Good debt is debt that someone else retires for you. When a tenant's rent payment covers your mortgage, your insurance, your taxes, and deposit surplus into your account, you have constructed a situation where a third party is building your net worth on your behalf. You provided the structure, the down payment, the due diligence, the management. But the labor of repayment? That belongs to the tenant. You have outsourced the most expensive part of the equation. This is not a trick. It's architecture, and it scales. The same logic applies to a business loan that funds equipment increasing your output, or capital borrowed to hire someone whose productivity generates more than their cost. In each case, the asset or the person the debt acquired is doing the work of retiring the obligation. Your personal labor is insulated from the repayment. You are the architect of the system, not the engine of it. That distinction between being the architect and being the engine is perhaps the clearest line between building wealth and merely surviving financially. Now, the tax dimension. And this deserves more precision than it usually gets. Bad debt is serviced with after-tax dollars. You earn money, the government takes its portion, and you pay the bank with what remains. Every dollar of credit card interest, every payment on a personal car loan costs you more than its face value because you had to earn significantly more than $1 to have $1 to spend. The true cost of bad debt is always higher than the stated interest rate because the stated rate is applied to money you've already been taxed on. Good debt, debt on investment property, on business assets, on income-generating activities, is often serviced with pre-tax dollars. The interest becomes a deductible expense. The government effectively subsidizes the cost of your investment borrowing, which means, structurally, the tax code has encoded a preference. It rewards the person who borrows to produce and penalizes the person who borrows to consume. This isn't an accident or an oversight. It's a deliberate design. The government wants capital deployed into productive assets because productive assets generate economic activity and tax revenue. They built an incentive into the law to encourage you to do exactly that. Borrowing to get rich is, by design, cheaper than borrowing to look rich. Take an honest inventory today, not a comfortable one, an honest one. Look at every obligation you carry. If you find bad debt, don't justify it. Don't negotiate with it. Attack it. Sell the depreciating asset if you must. Cut the service. Eliminate the subscription. Direct every available dollar at the principal until it's gone. Bad debt is a wound that doesn't heal on its own. It requires intervention. And then, don't be afraid of good debt when the opportunity presents itself correctly. The goal is not to be debt-free. A person with zero debt and zero assets is safe, the way a person standing still in a burning building is safe. They're not on fire yet, but they're not moving toward the exit either. The goal is financial freedom, and financial freedom is built through assets. Assets often require capital. Capital often requires debt. The sequence is unavoidable for most people. What is avoidable is confusion between the two kinds. Every dollar you borrow must be a soldier. It must be sent somewhere it will return with reinforcements. If it comes back alone, or doesn't come back at all, you made a strategic error that will cost you years. Know the difference. Draw the line clearly. And never, under any circumstances, allow bad debt to masquerade as investment just because the intention behind it sounds noble. The math doesn't grade on intention. Chapter 6. Avoid refinancing traps. The offer always arrives when you're tired. Not physically tired, necessarily, but financially tired. You've been making payments for 2 years. The balance feels immovable. The monthly obligation has become a low-grade pressure that follows you into the weekend. And then an envelope arrives, or an email, or a banker calls with that particular tone of voice that sounds like good news. They have a solution. Lower payments, better rate, a little more breathing room. The relief you feel in that moment is real. And it is precisely what makes the trap effective. Banks are not in the business of giving you breathing room. They are in the business of extending the duration of your obligation. And refinancing, presented as relief, packaged as opportunity, is frequently the most elegant mechanism they have for keeping you in debt longer than you originally agreed to be. The offer feels like they're doing you a favor. What they're actually doing is resetting the clock. You need to understand something about amortization that most borrowers never fully internalize. In the early years of a loan, the overwhelming majority of each payment is interest, not principal. The bank collects its profit first. Your progress against the actual debt is agonizingly slow at the beginning and accelerates only as you move through the schedule. The equity you've built, the principal you've reduced, these represent real progress, real value, years of your payments finally beginning to work for you rather than for the lender. When you refinance, you frequently surrender that progress. You reset the amortization schedule. You go back to the beginning of the curve, where the bank again collects predominantly interest, where your payments are again doing more for their revenue than for your equity. The progress you made over 2, 5, 7 years, quietly discarded in exchange for a lower monthly number. This is the sunk cost running forward. The payments you made during those early years weren't wasted, but the progress they bought, the position you'd climb to on the amortization schedule, that gets abandoned the moment you sign new papers. Most people never calculate this. They see the lower payment and feel the relief and sign. The bank has modeled exactly this behavioral sequence. The offer is engineered for it. There's a psychological dimension here that compounds the financial one. Refinancing trains a specific response to financial pressure. The response is restructure rather than resolve. When debt becomes uncomfortable, you don't fight through it. You reshape it into something more comfortable. And because the comfort is real, even if temporary, the brain files this as a successful strategy. Next time the pressure builds, the same solution presents itself. The debt never dies. It just keeps changing shape. The hedonic treadmill, which researchers use to describe how humans adapt to improvements and return to baseline satisfaction, applies here with uncomfortable precision. You refinance. The payment drops. For a few months, the pressure lifts and the relief is genuine. Then the new payment becomes normal. The baseline resets. The financial anxiety returns, not because your situation has worsened, but because humans adapt to relief as quickly as they adapt to burden. And now you're further from freedom than you were before, but you feel the same as you did before the refinance. You spent years of progress to buy a few months of relief. Then there are the costs the glossy brochures bury in the fine print. Refinancing is not free. Closing costs, origination fees, appraisal fees, title insurance, legal fees, these are real money, often thousands of dollars, paid up front or rolled into the new loan balance. If they're rolled in, you are now paying interest on the fees you paid to get the loan. You are borrowing to pay for the privilege of borrowing. This is a compound layer of waste that the lower interest rate rarely compensates for. The break-even calculation is the one you must run before anything else. Divide the total cost of refinancing by the monthly savings the new payment represents. The result is how many months it takes to recoup the cost of the transaction. If that number is 36 months and you plan to sell the property or pay off the loan in 24 months, you have lost money with mathematical certainty. The lower rate was irrelevant. The friction cost ate the gain. Let me be direct about the term extension, because this is where the most damage is done and the least scrutiny is applied. Imagine 15 years remaining on a mortgage at 6%. A bank offers you 5%, a full percentage point lower, which sounds significant, but they reset the term to 30 years. The rate is lower, the payment is lower, and the total amount you will pay to own that house, the cumulative interest across 30 years versus 15, will be dramatically, shockingly higher than if you'd stayed the course. You will have paid for the same house twice over in interest, just more slowly and more comfortably. Lower rate plus longer term is almost always worse than higher rate plus shorter term. The interest rate is the price per unit of time. If you're renting money for twice as long, the lower price per day is irrelevant. You've doubled the rental period. There is exactly one version of refinancing that makes mathematical sense. The interest rate drops substantially, not marginally, and you keep your monthly payment identical to what it was before. You do not pocket the difference. You do not upgrade your life with the savings. You apply the same payment to the new lower rate loan and allow the term to shorten organically. You get the benefit of the lower rate without extending your obligation. You arrive at freedom sooner, and you pay less in total. But almost nobody does this, because the entire emotional logic of refinancing points toward relief, not acceleration. The person who refinances and keeps the same payment has understood the mathematics. The person who refinances and spends the savings has understood only the feeling. You must be the former. And if you cannot guarantee that you will be the former, if you know honestly that the extra monthly cash will disappear into ordinary spending within 60 days, then the refinancing offer should be declined regardless of the rate. Stay on the original schedule. Let the discomfort of the payment be the engine of your urgency. The day the balance hits zero is the day you win. Every refinance that extends the term pushes that day further away. The finish line is real. Don't let them move it. Chapter 7. Build an emergency fund before borrowing. There's a specific kind of financial desperation that has nothing to do with being poor. It's the desperation of someone who has assets, has income, has a loan on something genuinely valuable. And then one thing goes wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, just ordinarily wrong. A transmission fails. A client delays payment by 6 weeks. A medical bill arrives that wasn't budgeted for. One thing. And because there's no buffer between that one thing and the loan obligation, the entire structure begins to crack. This is not bad luck. This is bad architecture. Before you borrow a single dollar, before you approach a bank, before you calculate returns, before you run the leverage math that makes the investment look compelling, you need to build a cash reserve that exists for no other purpose than absorbing the ordinary disasters of an ordinary life. Not investing it, not deploying it, not letting it sit in your brokerage account where it's technically accessible but psychologically earmarked for something else. Cash, liquid, separate, boring. untouchable except for genuine emergencies. This isn't a conservative suggestion for cautious people. This is structural engineering. When you take on a loan, you have created a fixed obligation in a world that generates variable events. Your payment is the same amount on the same date every month, regardless of what the economy does, what your employer decides, what your health requires, or what your car chooses to do on a Tuesday morning in February. The loan doesn't negotiate. The loan doesn't defer. The loan has a date and an amount and a consequence for non-compliance, and those three things are completely indifferent to your circumstances. Without a cash reserve, you have zero tolerance for variance, and life is entirely composed of variance. The behavioral economists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky spent years documenting how human decision-making degrades under conditions of stress and scarcity. When you're operating under financial pressure, when the payment is due and the account is thin and the options are narrowing, you are not accessing your full cognitive capacity. You're in what researchers call System 1 thinking. Fast, emotional, pattern matching, error-prone. The part of your brain that's good at solving complex financial problems, the prefrontal cortex, the deliberate reasoning system, gets partially offline when threat is perceived. This means financial emergencies don't just cost you money, they cost you judgment. And judgment in a crisis is the only thing that determines whether a difficult situation becomes a manageable one or a catastrophic one. The emergency fund is not just a financial buffer, it's a cognitive one. It keeps System 2, the slow, careful, rational decision-making system, accessible when you need it most. The person with 6 months of expenses in a liquid account faces the same broken transmission as the person with nothing in reserve. But they face it as a problem to be solved, not a crisis to be survived. Their cortisol levels are different. Their options feel different. Their decisions will be different. And those decisions, compounded across the duration of a financial setback, produce dramatically different outcomes. Here's what happens without the buffer, stated plainly. The emergency arrives. The checking account can't cover it, and the loan payment simultaneously. You look for money, and because you're in a state of financial stress, System 1 active, judgment compromised, options feeling scarce, you make the decision that provides the fastest relief, not the best outcome. You find a payday lender. You max the credit card. You take a cash advance at rates that would make a loan shark blush. You are now borrowing money to pay for borrowed money. The interest stacks. The fees compound. What began as a $600 transmission repair has become a debt spiral with 3 creditors, 2 different interest rates, and a credit score that's beginning to show the damage. None of this was inevitable. All of it was preventable. 3 months of expenses sitting in a separate account would have absorbed the entire incident without a ripple. There's another dimension here that rarely gets discussed. Cash gives you negotiating power. When you have reserves, you make decisions from a position of stability, not desperation. A borrower who has 6 months of expenses in the bank can walk away from a bad deal. They can wait for better terms. They can say no to a predatory refinancing offer without panicking about what happens next month. The borrower with no reserves cannot afford to say no to anything, because no is a luxury that requires options, and options require liquidity. Desperation is expensive, and it's always more expensive than the cost of the patience required to build the reserve before borrowing. I want to address the argument that most impatient investors make at this point, that having cash sitting in a low-yield account while a compelling investment opportunity exists is inefficient, that the opportunity cost of holding cash is too high, that the market won't wait. The market will always be there. The specific deal you're looking at may not be. But here's what's also true. If the investment is so fragile that a 3-month delay to build a proper cash reserve would cause you to miss it entirely, the investment was never as solid as it appeared. Real wealth-building opportunities are not so time-sensitive that they can't survive the weeks it takes to establish basic financial stability. If someone is pressuring you to move before you're properly capitalized, they are not protecting your interests. They are protecting their timeline. Build the fund first, without exception, without negotiation. Calculate your monthly expenses, including the new loan payment you intend to carry, and multiply by 6. That number, sitting in a liquid account you do not touch, is your minimum entry requirement for the world of debt. Not 3 months. 6. Because the things that go wrong rarely resolve in 3 months. Job losses average longer. Medical situations extend. Business downturns don't respect your personal repayment schedule. And don't make the mistake of counting a credit line as your emergency fund. Credit lines are extended at the bank's discretion. During the exact economic conditions most likely to create your emergency, recessions, market contractions, industry disruptions, banks tightened lending standards and reduce credit limits. The safety net you were counting on gets pulled at the moment you fall. Cash cannot be recalled. Cash cannot be suspended. Cash is yours, completely, with no institution standing between you and access to it. Build it before you borrow, not after, not simultaneously. Before. The foundation must be solid before you build the structure. Every contractor knows this. Every engineer knows this. And every borrower who has ever lost an asset they were trying to build because one bad month collapsed an undercapitalized position knows this too. Usually right around the moment it's too late. Chapter 8. Stick to your budget. Most people think a budget is a list. Income on one side, expenses on the other, a number at the bottom that tells you whether you're okay or not. They make it once, feel virtuous for approximately 4 days, and then stop looking at it because the number at the bottom was uncomfortable. That's not a budget. That's an accounting exercise with avoidance built in. A real budget, the kind that functions as the operating system for a borrower's financial life, is something structurally different. It is a decision made in advance about where every dollar goes, so that in the moment when the money is actually in your hand, and the restaurant looks appealing, and the sale is ending tonight, the decision is already done. The budget is not a record of what happened. It's a script for what will happen. The difference between those two things is the difference between managing debt and being managed by it. Here is the first and most important architectural choice in building that script. Your loan repayment is not a bill you pay after you've handled everything else. It is not an expense that competes with dinner and subscriptions and the occasional impulse purchase for whatever is left at the end of the month. It is the first allocation. It leaves your account before you've had the chance to want something with that money. It is as non-negotiable as rent, as automatic as breathing, as structurally fixed as any commitment you have ever made to your own survival. The moment you treat debt repayment as a variable expense, something you'll handle when things are comfortable, you've handed control of your financial life to circumstance. And circumstance is not a reliable steward. The psychologist Roy Baumeister spent years researching what he called ego depletion, the finding that willpower is not a fixed character trait, but a finite cognitive resource that degrades with use. Every decision you make throughout a day draws from the same pool. By evening, the pool is shallower. The discipline available to you at 9 in the morning is genuinely not available to you at 9 at night, not because you're weak, but because you're human, and cognition is metabolically expensive. This is why smart people make bad financial decisions at the end of long days. The resource that generates good decisions has been spent on other decisions. A budget defeats this problem not by strengthening your willpower, but by eliminating the decisions that require it. When the loan repayment is automated, when it leaves the account on the first of the month before you've touched the balance, willpower is never consulted. The decision was made once, in a calm moment, with full information. It doesn't need to be made again. Every day you don't have to decide whether to pay the loan is a day you don't spend willpower on the question. That preserved resource is available for everything else. This is what the budget actually does. It doesn't restrict your freedom. It automates it. Now, the tracking. And this part requires a level of attention that most people find uncomfortable, precisely because it reveals things they'd rather not see. Every dollar that flows through your life while you're carrying debt needs to be visible to you. Not approximately visible, not visible in the aggregate, specifically, categorically, line item visible. The coffee, the subscription you forgot you had, the impulse purchase that felt small in the moment and adds up to $400 across a month. Each of those dollars is not just a dollar. It's a dollar plus the interest it would have saved if directed at the principal instead. The true cost of a $30 dinner when you're carrying 8% debt is not $30. It's $30 plus the compound interest that $30 would have eliminated. Most people never calculate this. They see the price tag and not the full cost. The budget makes the full cost visible. There's a concept worth naming here: the credit score as biography. Your credit score is not a judgment handed down by an impersonal system. It is a compressed record of every financial decision you've made under pressure. Every month you had the money and paid. Every month you didn't and didn't. Each number in it is a residue of a specific moment. A paycheck that arrived, a payment that went out, a crisis that was either handled or wasn't. The person you are at the credit bureau today was assembled from choices made across years, many of which felt minor at the time. A strict budget protects that biography. It ensures that when the unexpected expense arrives, and it will arrive, the loan payment is already secured. The category is funded. The payment goes out regardless. And the credit record reflects a person who keeps their commitments even when keeping them is difficult. This is not just a number, it's a reputation. And reputation in the financial world has a direct price: the interest rate you'll be offered on every loan for the rest of your life. Destroy the reputation through inconsistency, and you pay a tax on every future transaction. Protect it through discipline, and the system rewards you with cheaper capital, better terms, more options. The budget is the mechanism that protects it. Let me say something that the motivational version of this content skips over. There will be months when the budget reveals that you are losing, that despite your income, despite your discipline, despite your intentions, the numbers don't add up. The expenses exceed the allocation. The surplus you planned on doesn't exist. These months are not failures. They are information. The budget's job in those months is not to make you feel good. Its job is to show you exactly where the breach occurred so you can close it. Most people respond to this information by closing the spreadsheet, by deciding the budget isn't working rather than deciding the spending isn't working. The budget is always working. It is always showing you the truth. The question is whether you're willing to act on what it shows. If the numbers consistently don't work, something structural must change. Not the budget, the life the budget is describing. A second income source, a reduction in fixed costs, a downsizing that feels like retreat but is actually strategy. The budget will tell you which lever to pull. Your job is to pull it without sentiment. And then there is the snowball. When the budget is functioning, when every dollar has an assignment and the loan repayment is untouchable and the tracking is honest, something begins to happen. Small surpluses appear. The month you cook at home instead of eating out, $200 is freed. The month you cancel the subscriptions you weren't using, another $100. A strict budget doesn't just prevent waste, it excavates it. It finds money that was already there, invisible under the sediment of unconsidered spending. That money goes to the principal, immediately, without deliberation. The policy is already set. And here is what that does mathematically. It accelerates the amortization curve. More principal paid means less interest. Accruing next month means more of next month's payment. Attacking principal means even less interest the month after. The snowball builds, slowly at first, then with a momentum that surprises people who've never watched it happen. The last years of a loan paid with discipline look nothing like the first years. The balance drops faster than you expect. The end date moves toward you. This is not a metaphor. This is arithmetic operating in your favor for once. The loan you took was a tool. The budget is the hand that holds it. Without the hand, the tool does whatever gravity dictates. With it, the tool builds exactly what you intended when you borrowed. And then, when the debt is finally gone, the same discipline that serviced the obligation begins servicing your wealth instead. The hand doesn't change, only what it's holding. Chapter 9. Understand your interest rate. Here is something almost nobody tells you about an interest rate. It is not a percentage, it is a velocity. It describes how fast money moves, away from you or toward you, per unit of time. When you borrow at 8% annually, you are not simply paying 8 cents on every dollar once. You are setting a clock in motion, a clock that runs every day, every hour, every minute you hold that balance. The interest doesn't wait for your payment date to start accumulating. It starts the moment the loan is funded. It runs on weekends. It runs on holidays. It runs while you sleep, and while you're at work, and while you're sitting across from a banker who is explaining with practiced calm that the rate is very competitive right now. Most borrowers think about interest rates the way they think about price tags, a fixed cost attached to a fixed thing. This is the misunderstanding that costs people decades of wealth. An interest rate is not a price tag. It is a rate of transfer. It describes a continuous, relentless movement of value from your balance sheet to the lenders. The longer you hold the balance, the more total value transfers. The rate stays the same. The damage accumulates. This reframe changes everything about how you should evaluate a loan. The number most lenders advertise is the nominal rate, the headline figure, the one in large print on the offer letter. But the number that actually governs what you pay is the APR, the annual percentage rate, which includes fees, origination costs, and other charges folded into the effective cost of borrowing. The gap between the nominal rate and the APR is where the lender's margin hides. A loan advertised at 5% with significant origination fees might carry an effective APR closer to 6 or 6.5. That gap, compounded across a 30-year mortgage, represents tens of thousands of dollars. You must always ask for the APR, not the rate, the APR. And then you must calculate the total interest paid across the full term of the loan, not the monthly payment, not the annual cost, but the cumulative total. That number is the true price of the loan. It is the number that should determine whether you sign. Most people never calculate it. The monthly payment feels manageable, and manageable feels like the right answer. But manageability is a measure of short-term cash flow, not total cost. A loan can be completely manageable monthly and catastrophically expensive in total. The bank is hoping you'll evaluate the former and ignore the latter. Now, compound interest. Einstein may or may not have called it the eighth wonder of the world. The attribution is probably apocryphal, but the sentiment is accurate regardless of who said it. Compounding is the mechanism by which interest generates interest. When you carry a balance that accrues interest and don't pay the full amount down, the interest that accrued last period gets added to the principal. Next period, you're paying interest on a larger base. The base grows. The interest grows. The growth accelerates. On a debt you're paying down, compounding works against you but is eventually defeated by your payments. On a debt you're only servicing minimally, a credit card balance carried month to month, a loan where you're barely covering interest. Compounding is an engine running in the wrong direction with no brake applied. The balance doesn't stay flat. It grows. Slowly at first, and then with a momentum that begins to feel impossible to reverse. The credit card is the most dangerous vehicle for this dynamic because the rates are designed for it. A credit card charging 22% annual interest is not asking you for 22%. It is asking you for 22% per year, compounded monthly, on a balance that grows every time you don't pay it in full. At that velocity, a $1,000 balance that you're paying the minimum on doesn't diminish. It expands. And it expands faster than most people's minimum payments can contain. This is not a bug in the system. It is the system. There is a specific trap worth naming separately, the 0% financing offer. A car dealership, an appliance store, a furniture company, they offer you 0% interest for 24 months, and it genuinely sounds like free money. And sometimes it is close to free money if you pay the full balance before the promotional period ends and the contract contains no retroactive interest clause. But many of these agreements contain deferred interest, not zero interest. The distinction is critical and deliberately obscured. With deferred interest, the interest is accruing throughout the promotional period. It's just not being charged yet. If you carry any balance at all on the day the promotional period expires, the entire accumulated interest from the full term becomes immediately due. The 0% wasn't zero. It was a loan against your future compliance. One missed payoff date, and the full interest bill arrives at once. Read the contract, specifically the section titled something like Promotional Financing Terms or Deferred Interest Conditions. If you see the words deferred interest rather than no interest, treat the offer as a high-rate loan in disguise, because that is what it is. There's a discipline that separates sophisticated borrowers from ordinary ones, and it's simpler than most people expect. Always know, at any given moment, the exact interest rate on every debt you carry, the total remaining balance, and the total interest you will pay if you follow the current payment schedule to its end. Not approximately. Exactly. These three numbers should be as familiar to you as your own phone number, because here's what knowing them does. It makes the debt real in a way that monthly payments don't. A monthly payment of $400 feels like a utility bill, a recurring cost of existence, mildly annoying but fundamentally abstract. But knowing that you will pay $62,000 in total interest over the life of a loan, that is not abstract. That is a number that demands a response. That is a number that makes you want to find extra principal payments the way hunger makes you want food. Ignorance about your interest rate is expensive, not metaphorically, numerically. Every month you don't know exactly what your debt is costing you is a month you're less motivated to attack it, less equipped to compare alternatives, less able to make rational decisions about refinancing or early repayment or consolidation. Know the velocity at which your money is moving away from you. Then decide how fast you want to move it back. Chapter 10. Negotiate loan terms. The number the bank gives you first is not the number they need. It is the number they want, There's a difference, and that difference is where your negotiating room lives. Most borrowers never find it because most borrowers walk into a lending conversation with the psychological posture of a supplicant, grateful for approval, relieved to be considered, afraid that pushing back will cost them the deal. And so they accept the first offer. They sign on the terms presented. They leave the bank having paid for the privilege of not negotiating. This is one of the most expensive social habits a borrower can carry. The psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman identified what they called the anchoring effect, one of the most robust and consistently replicated findings in behavioral economics. When a number is presented first in a negotiation, it functions as a gravitational anchor. All subsequent evaluation happens in relation to that number. If a lender opens with an interest rate of 7%, your brain doesn't evaluate 7% against an abstract ideal. It evaluates 7% against 7%. A counter of 6.5 feels like a win. Whether 6.5 is actually a good rate for your credit profile and current market conditions is a separate question that the anchoring effect actively prevents you from asking. The bank knows this. The opening offer is engineered with this knowledge built in. The counter anchor is your primary tool. Before you walk into any lending conversation, you need to know the market rate for a borrower of your profile, your credit score range, your debt-to-income ratio, your collateral quality, not approximately, specifically. You need to have spoken to at least 3 lenders before committing to any of them, because the act of comparison shopping is itself the most effective negotiating position you can arrive with. When you can tell a lender that their competitor offered you 6.25 and you'd prefer to work with them if they can match it, you have transformed yourself from a supplicant into a customer with options. The power in the room shifts, and the shift is real. Lenders have rate ranges, not fixed rates. The rate you're quoted is rarely the floor of what they'll accept. There is almost always room between the number they open with and the number that would cause them to lose the deal. Your job is to find that room without apologizing for looking. The Stoics had a principle that applies here with unusual precision. Enter every agreement as though you may need to exit it. Before Cato signed any contract, before Marcus Aurelius committed Rome to any treaty, there was a cold assessment of what the terms looked like from the outside, from the position of someone who might need to walk away. This practice strips the emotional urgency from the negotiation. You are not desperate for this loan. You are evaluating whether this loan on these terms serves your financial strategy. If it doesn't, you leave. The bank needs borrowers more than any individual borrower needs that specific bank. Carry that posture into every lending conversation. Beyond the interest rate, there are terms that most borrowers never think to negotiate because they don't know they're negotiable. Origination fees are frequently negotiable. Lenders often waive or reduce them for borrowers who ask directly and have competitive offers in hand. Prepayment penalties, clauses that charge you for paying the loan off early, are sometimes negotiable out of the contract entirely, and you should always try to remove them because a prepayment penalty is a lender charging you for the crime of becoming debt-free ahead of schedule. It is a fee for your own discipline. Refuse it if you can. Loan term length is negotiable. The standard offering of a 30-year mortgage or a 5-year business loan exists because it serves the lender's preference for long-duration interest collection, not because it's the optimal structure for your financial life. A borrower who walks in requesting a 20-year term or who asks what rate differential exists between a 15 and a 30-year product is accessing a conversation that the standard intake process never opens. Lenders have products for motivated borrowers. They just don't advertise them to people who haven't demonstrated that they're motivated. There's a specific leverage point that most borrowers underestimate: the timing of the application. Lenders have targets, quarterly targets, annual targets, end-of-month targets. A borrower who understands that a loan officer trying to close volume before the end of the quarter is operating under different pressures than one who has just reset their metrics. That borrower can time conversations to arrive when the lender's incentive to close aligns with the borrower's incentive to get favorable terms. This isn't manipulation, it's reading the room. Every negotiation happens inside a context. The context shapes what's possible. Your credit score is your primary credential in this conversation, and it should be managed with exactly that in mind. A credit score is not a passive reflection of your financial behavior. It is an active instrument that you construct deliberately over time. Every payment made on time, every utilization ratio kept low, every unnecessary credit inquiry avoided. These are investments in future negotiating power. The borrower with a 750 credit score and the borrower with a 680 are not negotiating with the same leverage, even if they're standing at the same bank on the same day asking for the same amount. The difference in interest rate between those two credit profiles, compounded across a 30-year mortgage, can exceed $50,000. $50,000 that was always available to the person who managed their credit as the financial instrument it is, and permanently unavailable to the person who treated it as an afterthought. Here's something worth sitting with. Most people spend more time negotiating the price of a car, researching, comparing, countering, walking out, coming back, than they spend negotiating the loan that finances it. The car negotiation might save them $1,000. The loan negotiation, done well, might save them $10,000. The asymmetry is irrational. But it exists because the car price feels like a negotiation, and the loan offer feels like a verdict. It is not a verdict. It is an opening position. Treat it accordingly. Chapter 12. Debt as a psychological weight. Nobody puts this in the loan document. There's no line item for the way debt follows you into rooms it has no business being in. The job interview where, underneath the practiced confidence, there's a quiet calculation running. I can't afford to walk away from an offer, any offer. The relationship conversation you don't have because financial stress has been sitting between you and the other person for months, unnamed but present. The Sunday afternoon that should be rest but feels like a low-grade emergency because Monday brings a payment and the account is closer to the edge than you'd like. Debt is not just a financial condition. It is a cognitive one. And the cognitive cost is the one that never appears in any interest rate calculation, never gets factored into any borrower's risk assessment, and yet may be the most consequential cost the loan carries. The economists Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir spent years researching what they called the psychology of scarcity, the measurable effect of financial pressure on human cognitive capacity. Their findings were striking and largely ignored by mainstream financial advice. When people are under financial stress, they don't just feel worse, they think worse. The mental bandwidth consumed by financial worry, the background processing of payment calculations, the contingency planning, the low-level threat monitoring is equivalent in cognitive impact to losing a full night's sleep. Every day, not occasionally, persistently, as a baseline condition of carrying debt that feels unmanageable. This means debt doesn't just drain your bank account, it drains the cognitive resource you need to solve the problem. The person most in need of clear financial thinking is often the person least able to access it, because the stress of the debt has partially occupied the mental architecture required for strategic thought. You are trying to navigate a complex situation with a map that the situation itself has made harder to read. This is not weakness. This is neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, rational decision-making, and impulse control, is sensitive to stress hormones. Elevated cortisol, which financial anxiety reliably produces, measurably impairs prefrontal function. The part of your brain best equipped to make good decisions about debt is partially offline because of the debt. The irony is structural and cruel, and understanding it should produce compassion rather than judgment, for yourself and for anyone else carrying a financial burden that has become psychological. But understanding it should also produce urgency, because the cognitive tax of unmanaged debt is compounding in a way that doesn't appear on any balance sheet. Think about what that bandwidth could be doing instead. The mental energy spent on low-level financial anxiety, the background hum of worry that runs beneath everything else, is energy unavailable for creative work, for strategic thinking, for the quality of presence that good relationships require. Debt doesn't just constrain your financial options, it constrains your attention. And attention, directed with purpose, is the mechanism by which most good things in a life get built. There's a specific way debt restricts the architecture of your choices that goes beyond money. When you have significant monthly obligations, you cannot afford optionality. You cannot take the lower-paying job that would develop you faster. You cannot take 6 months to build something uncertain. You cannot weather a period of transition between one thing and the next, because the payments don't recognize transitions. They arrive on schedule regardless of what chapter of your life you're in. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who was a slave before he was a philosopher, understood freedom not as the absence of physical constraint, but as the presence of choice. The person who can say no to a job, to a situation, to a relationship that has stopped serving them, is free in the way that matters. The person who cannot say no because the financial architecture of their life has removed that option is constrained regardless of what their employment contract calls them. Debt, when it exceeds a certain threshold relative to your income and assets, removes the ability to say no. And removing the ability to say no is removing freedom in the most practical sense of the word. This is what the wealthy understand about debt elimination that doesn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. The goal isn't just the net worth number, it's the restoration of optionality. It's the recovery of the ability to make choices based on what you actually want, rather than what you can afford to risk. Every debt paid down is not just a liability reduced, it is a constraint removed, a door that was locked becoming unlocked, a no that was previously unaffordable becoming available. And there is a psychological reversal that happens, and it happens faster than most people expect, when debt begins to visibly decrease. The anxiety doesn't wait for the balance to reach zero. It begins to lift when the direction changes, when the number is moving the right way, when the momentum is yours rather than the bank's. Something shifts in the body before it shifts in the account. The background hum quiets. The Sunday afternoons begin to feel like rest again. The job interview recovers its confidence because the answer to, "Could I walk away from this?" is starting to become yes. I want to be honest about something here. There is a version of debt management content that treats the psychological dimension as a side effect, a nice bonus that comes with the financial discipline, the emotional reward for doing the math correctly. I don't think that's quite right. I think for many people, the psychological dimension is the primary stake. The money is almost secondary to the question of what it feels like to live inside a financial life that is working versus one that is slowly compressing. The numbers matter. The strategy matters. But the reason the numbers and the strategy matter is that human beings live in their nervous systems, not in their spreadsheets. And a nervous system carrying the chronic low-grade stress of financial pressure is not functioning at the level required to build the life the spreadsheet is supposed to be describing. Manage the debt, not just for the net worth, for the quality of the mind you bring to everything else. Because everything else, the work, the relationships, the decisions, the capacity to be present in your own life runs on the same system that financial stress degrades. Protect that system. Chapter 13. The Long Game, When Debt Becomes Wealth. There's a moment that almost nobody warns you about. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. There's no ceremony. The bank doesn't call to congratulate you. You check the balance one morning and the number is 0, or close enough to 0 that the distance is measured in weeks rather than years. And instead of the euphoria you expected, the clean, uncomplicated relief you've been picturing for years, what you feel is something stranger, quieter, a kind of stillness where the pressure used to be, like a sound you'd lived with so long you stopped hearing it, suddenly gone, and the silence itself takes adjustment. That stillness is the beginning of something. What you've built during the years of repayment isn't just a paid-off loan. You've built something more durable and more transferable than any specific financial product. You've built a set of habits so deeply grooved that they now run without requiring conscious maintenance. The automated payment that used to go to the lender, it still leaves your account on the same date. But now it goes somewhere else. The budget that used to be a constraint is now a targeting system. The discipline that felt like deprivation is now revealed as what it always was: precision. The ability to direct resources exactly where you intend them to go, without leakage, without drift, without the ordinary human tendency to let good intentions dissolve in the friction of daily life. This is the inflection point. The moment the same instrument that carried you through debt begins carrying you toward wealth. The Stoics had a concept they called amor fati, love of fate, not passive acceptance of what happens, but active embrace of it. The idea that the obstacle is not separate from the path. It is the path. The difficulty of the years spent in repayment, the delayed gratification, the invisible sacrifice, the Sunday afternoon spent reviewing a budget instead of ignoring one. That difficulty was not punishment endured on the way to the real work. It was the real work. The character built under the pressure of obligation is precisely the character required to build wealth, not a prerequisite to it, the thing itself. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire and fought wars and managed senators who wanted him dead, and he wrote, in private notes never intended for publication, that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The years you spent constrained by debt were the years you were developing the exact capacities that make the unconstrained years productive. Strip away the debt, and what remains is the person the debt built. That person is more capable than the one who started. Most financial content treats the post-debt phase as a destination. You arrive, you've won. Now do whatever you want. This is the wrong frame. The post-debt phase is not a destination. It is a platform. And what you build on it depends entirely on whether you understand that the discipline doesn't stop when the obligation does. The person who reaches 0 and immediately expands their lifestyle to consume the freed cash flow has missed the point entirely. They've traded one form of servitude, to the lender, for another, to their own expanded appetites. The monthly surplus that used to service debt now services a bigger apartment and a nicer car, and a lifestyle that feels like reward, but functions like a new set of chains. The freedom they worked years to achieve gets immediately exchanged for comfort. And comfort, as the Stoics knew, is the most insidious constraint of all, because it feels like success while quietly preventing it. The person who understands the long game does something different. They redirect the cash flow. The same amount that went to the lender now goes to an investment account, a business, a rental property, a portfolio of assets that generates income independent of their labor. They don't feel the difference in their daily life because they built the budget around that amount being unavailable for discretionary spending. The money was already gone. Now it's going somewhere better. And here is where the mathematics become genuinely startling. The same compounding that worked against you during the debt years now works for you. The interest that used to transfer from your balance sheet to the lenders now accrues in the opposite direction. The assets appreciate. The dividends reinvest. The rental income compounds into additional properties. The business revenue funds expansion. Time, which was the enemy when debt was accruing, becomes the ally when assets are accumulating. The wealthy don't look dramatically different from disciplined debt repayers in their daily habits. They track their money. They live within structures. They make decisions based on numbers rather than feelings. They delay gratification in service of a longer horizon. The difference is not the behavior. The behavior is identical. The difference is the direction the money flows as a result of that behavior. During the debt years, the discipline sends money to the lender. After the debt years, the same discipline sends money to your own balance sheet. The habit doesn't change. The destination does. There's a failure mode worth naming directly because it is common and rarely discussed. Some people reach the end of the debt repayment phase and find themselves without a clear next objective. The goal of reaching zero was so consuming, so structurally dominant in their financial life, that its absence creates a kind of purposelessness. The discipline that was maintained by the pressure of obligation loses its anchor when the obligation disappears. Without a new target to direct the surplus toward, the money diffuses. Lifestyle inflates gradually, invisibly, through 100 small upgrades that each seem reasonable in isolation. The compounding never begins because the capital never gets concentrated. You must decide, before the balance reaches zero, where the money goes next. Not approximately, specifically. The investment account, the property, the business. It should be named and funded before the debt is fully retired, so that the redirection is seamless. No gap, no period of the money floating free and finding its own level, which is always the level of your lifestyle rather than the level of your ambition. The debt was the training. The wealth is the application. Don't finish the training and forget what you were training for. Conclusion. There's something you understand now that you didn't understand when you started. Debt was never the enemy. The enemy was the relationship, the unconscious one, the fearful one, the one shaped by everything you absorbed before you ever had a chance to think clearly about it. The belief that borrowing meant failing, that owing meant weakness, that the responsible path was the narrow one, the one that stayed small and safe and never asked the bank for anything. That belief has a cost, and it's a cost that never appears on any statement, never shows up in any calculation, never gets counted, because it exists entirely in the form of things that didn't happen. The asset never acquired, the leverage never used, the 10 years of compounding that never began because the first step required a signature, and the signature required a courage that fear had quietly removed. The most dangerous loan is not the one you took. It's the one you never took because fear told you not to, and the asset you never built is the cost you never counted. What this book has given you is not a set of rules. Rules are brittle. They break under the pressure of specific circumstances, under the weight of genuine complexity, under the particular conditions of a life that no general principle fully anticipated. What you've been given is a framework for thinking about velocity and direction, about the difference between assets and liabilities, about the psychological machinery that operates underneath every financial decision you make. You know now that interest is a rate of transfer, not a price tag. You know that leverage requires a fixed point, or it amplifies loss as readily as gain. You know that the planning fallacy will make every future projection more optimistic than it should be, and that the stoic antidote, premeditate the worst case, build for it, then act, is not pessimism, but architecture. You know that the budget is not a restriction, but an automation of discipline, that the emergency fund is not conservatism, but cognition protection, that the credit score is not a judgment, but a biography being written in real time. And you know, perhaps most importantly, that the discipline developed under the pressure of debt is not a temporary inconvenience on the way to the real work. It is the real work. The person built by the years of repayment is the person capable of the years of accumulation. The loan you sign next will be different, not because the terms will necessarily be better, though they may be, but because the person signing it will be different, clearer, more deliberate, less afraid, and more precise. Somebody who understands what they're holding and where they're pointing it. That's the only advantage that lasts. This is where most people stop, but this is exactly where your work begins. Knowledge means nothing without action. Discipline means everything when no one is watching. If you made it this far, you're already different. So like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment below with one action you're going to take after this. Make it real. Make it count. Now go and prove it to yourself. I'll see you in the next one.